Hi everyone. This lecture we will be diving into the fallacies of deductive logic. Fallacies are mistakes in the way in which we reason, mistakes in the logic that we're using. And so if you'll remember that arguments can go wrong in two ways. Either the structure is bad or the content is bad. So an argument can either be invalid or unsound. When we use fallacies, we're unintentionally or intentionally making a mistake in terms of whether or not the argument is valid or sound. So sometimes we might be intentionally or unintentionally assuming that some argument is structured properly, where the premises infer the conclusion, or we're assuming that some premise is true, when in reality it's not either. And so there are hundreds of different fallacies. We're going to go through some of the more popular fallacies, and these will be the fallacies that you will need to remember for your quiz and also the final exam. And so we need to make a distinction between two different types of deductive fallacies: logical or formal fallacies and informal fallacies. Formal fallacies are going to be those fallacies that are made when looking at the structure of an argument, while informal fallacies are fallacies that are made when looking at the content. And so we'll first look at a couple popular formal fallacies. So two of the formal fallacies that we're going to look at is affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent. So if you'll remember, when we use conditional statements in propositional logic, the thing attached to the if part, the sufficient part for the then part, this is the antecedent. And the consequent is the necessary part, the then part, that is necessary for the if part. So if I tell you if P then Q, Q is the consequent, P is the antecedent. And when we get these confused, we're often making a mistake in terms of how we're forming the argument, how we're structuring this particular proposition in relation to our conclusion. Now, these can get pretty tricky because they're very similar to good forms of arguments that we'll talk about here in a second, affirming the antecedent and denying the consequent, which are good types of argument. And when we are affirming the antecedent, we are saying that if P is true, then Q is true, and then we're saying that P is Q, therefore it must be the case that Q is true. This is referred to as a modus ponens argument, an argument that affirms by affirming the antecedent. If we were to suggest if P then Q, but then not Q, we can therefore conclude that not P. So here we're saying that not Q means that P can't be true as well. This is a modus tollens argument. So we're denying by denying the consequent. If we're to look at this example of a modus ponens and modus tollens argument, we can perhaps see clearly how the sufficient and consequent relate to one another in the argument. So if I say in the left column, if this fruit is a banana, then it is yellow. This fruit is a banana is the antecedent, and this fruit is yellow is the consequent. So here you'll notice that I'm saying if this fruit is a banana, then it is yellow, and then I'm saying it is a banana. So I'm affirming the antecedent. I can then conclude my consequent that this fruit, is yellow. Now compare that to the modus tollens argument. also a good form of argument. These are not the fallacies. These are good arguments. If this fruit is a banana, then it is yellow. Here, once again, this fruit is a banana is the antecedent. This fruit is yellow is the consequent. But here I'm denying that this fruit is yellow by saying that this fruit is not yellow. I can therefore conclude that it's not a banana because remember, if it's a banana, it has to be yellow. Being a banana is sufficient for it being yellow. And being yellow is necessary upon it being a banana. So if it's not yellow, it can't be a banana. Now, when we get these confused by suggesting that if this fruit is a banana, then it is yellow, we can't reverse the condition and suggest that if this thing is yellow, then it is a banana. Otherwise, we are confusing the antecedent with the consequent and what is necessary and sufficient of what. Here's an example of the fallacy affirming the consequent. If you look on the left, we have the good argument modus ponens, if P then Q, and then we're suggesting that P is true. Well, we know that Q then therefore has to be true. When we're affirming the consequent, however, rather than affirming the antecedent, the P, we're affirming the consequent and suggesting that if P then Q, and then Q is true, that P must be true. But this is of course problematic because remember, Q is necessary for P, but not sufficient. So if we look at the example of the fruit and the banana, if this fruit is a banana, then it is yellow. This thing is yellow, therefore it is a banana. Doesn't make sense because there are multiple things that are yellow. I might say if this fruit is a banana, then it's yellow. This thing is yellow, which could be any yellow thing, perhaps a lemon. I can't then therefore conclude that it's a banana because being yellow is not a sufficient condition upon being a banana. It is a necessary one. So here we are mistaking the necessary and sufficient causes and trying to conclude something that isn't deductively inferred. Now, like affirming the consequent, we can see that denying the antecedent does a very similar thing. When we look at a modus tollens argument, again, this is a good argument. If P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. That is different than me saying if P, then Q, not P, therefore not Q. The reason is because P is sufficient for Q, but not P is not sufficient for not Q. Take this example. If this fruit is a banana, then it's yellow. Now, if this thing is not a banana, I can't therefore conclude that it's not yellow because what happens if I'm holding a lemon? If I'm holding a lemon, then this argument does not follow. By denying the antecedent, we're confusing what is necessary and sufficient. Remember, being yellow is a necessary condition upon being a banana, but that doesn't mean that if it's not a banana, it can't be yellow. There are other ways or other things that are yellow. So we need to make sure that the necessary and sufficient condition are placed in the right order and we're not confusing the two. This is why it's so important that we understand what is necessary and sufficient of what when using conditional claims. It's important that we get the right order, otherwise we are committing a logical fallacy, a mistake in deductive logic where it seems as though we're inferring the conclusion, but really we're not. So give this exercise a go and tell me which of the two fallacies is being committed here. Is it affirming the consequent or denying the antecedent? Pause the video now. For this argument, we are affirming the consequent. If he were having an affair, he would buy me flowers. He has bought me flowers, therefore he is having an affair. Now remember, buying flowers is a necessary condition upon having an affair, but it is not necessarily the case the only instance in which someone would buy someone else flowers. For instance, I might think that it's someone's anniversary, and this is why this person has bought the other flowers, and need not infer that one partner is having an affair. We can see here that by affirming the consequent, we're suggesting that this is the only possibility, when in reality, it's not. How about this argument? Is this argument affirming the consequent or denying the antecedent? Pause the video now and decide for yourself. For this argument, we are denying the antecedent. Notice the first two premises. If I go out tonight, I'm going to miss my philosophy class tomorrow. I'm not going out tonight. We can't necessarily conclude that I'm not going to miss my philosophy class tomorrow because there are other ways in which I might miss my philosophy class that need not be my going out the night before. For instance, I may choose not to go out because I feel like I'm getting sick, in hopes that staying in will help me recover so that I can make it to my philosophy class tomorrow. But then waking up, I realize that I've gotten sick anyway, and so I will in fact miss the class, regardless of not going out the night before. Remember, for a good valid argument, we need to ask ourselves, if the premises are true, can I deny the conclusion? And in these instances, it seems as though I can, in which case the arguments are posing as valid when really they are not. These are the formal fallacies that often confuse people because they can be very interchangeably written. Now, the next group of fallacies are going to be the fallacies that are perhaps more common, but there are also a lot more informal fallacies. And again, an informal fallacy is a mistake in which we think that something is true when it really is not. And we use this to either make an argument sound valid, or we leave out of an argument so that the person reading or listening to the argument doesn't see the obvious falsity in the premise. It often helps when determining what fallacy is being committed to turn the arguments into standard form. When arguments are written in standard form, we can see and pick out which premise is false. Now, the first deductive fallacy that we're going to look at is the false dilemma fallacy. It's also known as the false dichotomy, the either-or fallacy, or the all-or-nothing fallacy. A false dilemma fallacy is a fallacy in which the words either-or present two exhaustive possibilities, when in fact there are other possibilities out there. For instance, looking back at an argument that we talked about earlier in the class, we can see when we turn this into standard form, the first premise, either we must support bourgeois ideology or we must support the socialist ideology. We must support the socialist ideology, therefore we must not support the bourgeois ideology. In premise 1, we are being told that we either must support one or the other. But in reality, this is not necessarily true. The world is rarely black and white, and so when someone says you must support the bourgeois ideology or support the socialist ideology, I might think to myself that I don't want to support either. Maybe there's a third option. So in America, if you support the Republican Party or the Democrat Party, what about the Libertarian Party? What about the Independent Party? What about the Green Party? You'll notice that there are more than just two options. And so suggesting that the two possibilities are the only possibilities is often a fallacy. We want to make sure that when either or is being used, that it in fact is exhaustive. Same thing goes here. To be rich, I've got to inherit money or marry money. I'm not going to inherit money, so I'd better marry money. When we turn this argument into standard form, we see it written like this. Now, the first premise, if I will be rich, then I will inherit money or I will marry money, is exhaustive of these two options, but is not necessarily indicative of reality. Why can't I work hard for my money? Perhaps I luck into my money by winning the lottery. There are other options than just inheriting it and marrying into it. And so, if this premise is not true, we do not need to accept our conclusion, even if the argument is valid, because it's based on false pretenses. Now, there are instances where either or options are exhaustive of one another. So we need to be careful of when either ors are used in the exhaustive way and when they're not. Here I'm saying you're either in or you're out. You're not in, you're out. So let's say that I ask you to rob a bank with me, and I say you're either in or you're out. There's no middle ground here. Your declining to participate is you opting out. You can't opt in a little bit by saying, oh, well, let me just drive the getaway car. That is you opting in. So here we can see there are some instances where you really do have exhaustive options. But if the argument is being used where there are multiple options, then we need not force ourselves into one camp or the other. The next argument, or the next fallacy that we're going to talk about is the begging the question fallacy. And the begging the question fallacy is an umbrella type of fallacy. There are types of begging the question fallacies. There are many types of begging the question fallacies. And so this is just a general category of types of deductive fallacies. And what a begging the question fallacy does is essentially it takes a premise as being true when in fact it is controversial at best. Remember, if your premises are not inherently true or commonly accepted, then the person making the argument might want you to support the controversial premise with more premises, making it a sub-conclusion. So when you form an argument and one of your premises is controversial, you are begging the question that your conclusion is true if in fact this one premise is true, but because we're not certain that this premise is true, we shouldn't accept that your conclusion is true. Take this argument, for instance. If we withdraw from Afghanistan now, we will be surrendering to the evil forces of Islamofascism, and we cannot allow that. Now, for this argument, we need to accept the premise that if we withdraw from Afghanistan now, we will be surrendering to the evil forces of Islamofascism. Now, I might not agree that that is necessarily the case, and because you are not proving that that is the case, but instead using this as a premise to prove that something else is the case, I needn't accept your argument without you first proving that your premise, this controversial premise, is true. I would hate to accept a conclusion later to find out that the reason for that conclusion is false. So here we can see that when we turn the argument into a standard form, premise 1 is not necessarily true and requires more premises or more argumentation to prove it before we can prove that we shouldn't withdraw. The circular argument is another fallacy that falls within this begging the question category. And a circular argument essentially uses its conclusion to prove its controversial premise. So here I'm using a controversial premise, but then trying to trick you into believing that that premise is true because the conclusion supports its truth. But remember, we're not using our conclusion to support our premises. Our premises need to support our conclusion. So our conclusion shouldn't do any work to prove premises. Take, for instance, this exchange. God exists. Someone else says, well, how do you know? Well, because the Bible says so. And why should I believe the Bible? Well, because it was written by God. Well, and how do I know that God exists? Well, because the Bible says so. And you can see we've gotten ourselves in a circle. When we turn this into standard form, we see these two arguments. If the Bible does not lie, then God exists. The Bible does not lie, therefore God exists. And if God exists, then the Bible does not lie. God exists, therefore the Bible does not lie. Now, I can perhaps get behind the first premises of these two arguments. If the Bible does not lie, then God exists. Let's pretend that's true. The second premise, the Bible does not lie, is somewhat controversial. And so I'm not going to blindly accept that to therefore get to the conclusion that God exists. Now, if I were to then argue or ask, well, how do you know the Bible does not lie? And then you provide the argument that if God exists, then the Bible does not lie, and God exists, therefore the Bible does not lie. We now see that God's existence is the controversial premise. And so in each one of these, I need a conclusion to guarantee a premise. But that's not the way arguments work. With an argument, it's the premises that guarantee the conclusion. Otherwise, you're just going in a circle. The next type of fallacy is the equivocal argument, or the equivocal fallacy. This is used when we take the same sense of the word and manipulate it to seem as though it's different. Look at the argument below. It is not the case, as liberal philosophers often claim, that all human beings have the same rights in all places and times. In many parts of the world, men have the right to beat their wives. In the United States, they do not. Now, the problem with this argument is that there are two instances in which we use the word right. In the first sentence, we're saying that all human beings have the same moral rights in all times and places. While in the second sentence, we're saying that men have the legal right to beat their wives. Because we're using this term but with different definitions, we can sometimes be tricked into believing that an argument is valid because something is not true. So when we're using these arguments, it's important that we're clarifying all the terms, making sure that there are no ambiguities. Remember in a previous lecture that part of analyzing an argument and reconstructing an argument is to disambiguate any confusing terms. And here we see that the word right is confusing because it seems to be used in two different ways. The next fallacy is misplacing the burden of proof. Here, we're making the mistake of assuming that the work of the argument falls on one person's shoulders rather than the other. For instance, in a court of law, the burden of proof lies with the prosecution and not the defense. So it's not up to the defense to prove innocence, it's up to the prosecution to prove guilt. It wouldn't necessarily make sense if the defense had to prove innocence, because we don't really prove innocence. And if we look at a court of law, we can see that in just the terminology of options for conviction. Someone is either convicted as guilty or they're assumed to be not guilty. They're not innocent because proving innocence is something very different. Now, when it comes to the burden of proof, it is often with the person who is making an assertion opposed to what is typically the common sense or accepted position, or it is the person asserting the existence of something as opposed to denying it. For instance, take this exchange. Ghosts exist. Nonsense. What do you mean nonsense? Can you prove that ghosts don't exist? Versus this argument exchange. Ghosts don't exist. Nonsense. What do you mean nonsense? Can you prove that ghosts do exist? Here, it's the second argument that makes sense, as it should fall on the shoulders of the person proving that ghosts exist to make the argument. It would be difficult, if not impossible, to prove that ghosts don't exist, because to prove a negative can be much more difficult than proving the existence of something. I wouldn't necessarily be able to prove that ghosts don't exist. I'm not quite sure what that would even look like. I would have to know, in order to prove that ghosts don't exist, I would need to have a comprehensive list of all the things in the universe that exist and see that ghosts aren't on it. And this, of course, is unrealistic. The next fallacy we're going to look at is the appeal to common practice fallacy. Look at this argument. How can you be in favor of slavery? All progressive-minded people think it's wrong. The problem with this argument is that when we look at it in standard form, we see that the second premise isn't necessarily true. While it may be true that progressive-minded people believe that slavery is wrong, it's not necessarily the case that every belief held by progressive-minded people is true. Progressive-minded people can be just as wrong as anybody else. So to suggest that my conclusion is true because the common accepted understanding is true misses the mark. We don't want to support our argument with the belief that others also accept it, because others can be wrong. For instance, people used to believe that the Earth was the center of the universe. I don't believe that the Earth is the center of the universe because other people believe that the Earth is the center of the universe. And I don't believe that the Earth is not the center of the universe because other people believe that it's not the center of the universe. I believe that the Earth is not the center of the universe because of physical facts with how planets and our solar system work. It is not what people believe that makes something true. It is the facts about the world that make something true. So when I default or support my argument with what people say, that doesn't make anything true. Similarly, when I appeal to authority, I'm doing a very similar thing. Here we're saying that contraception is sinful. And why? Because the Pope has stated that contraception is sinful. And obviously, sinful is something that is in the wheelhouse of the Pope. And so here we have to accept, though, that everything the Pope says is true. But we don't want to suggest that just because the Pope says it, that makes it true. What makes it true are the facts of the world. Similarly, if I were to argue about the rotation or temperature of the sun, and a popular physicist by the name of Neil deGrasse Tyson appears on a podcast where he talks about the rotation and temperature of the sun. I can't then go to a family or friend and argue that the sun has a rotation and temperature of X because Neil deGrasse Tyson says so. Because Neil deGrasse Tyson could be wrong. Instead, I have to say that the rotation and temperature of the Earth is X because of facts about the world that make it so. Now, Neil deGrasse Tyson may explain that argument, but it's that argument that I need to support my conclusion, and not the mere fact that someone in an authority position says so, because anybody can be wrong. Ad hominem fallacies, like the begging the question fallacies, are fallacies of a certain type. They are a category of fallacy. They are the attack fallacy. Ad hominem fallacies are fallacies in which we pay attention to the person making the argument rather than the argument itself. Take this one. Rudy Giuliani is a corrupt and disgusting man. He married his second cousin, for God's sake. We should therefore not pay any attention to his arguments on Trump's legal dilemmas. If we were to look at this argument in standard form, we see if someone is corrupt and disgusting and marries his or her second cousin, we should not pay attention to his arguments. Rudy Giuliani is and does those things, therefore we should not listen to Rudy Giuliani. This is a logical fallacy because here I'm attacking an individual rather than attacking the argument. Just because somebody is corrupt and disgusting doesn't mean they're not equipped to answering questions about something that they are actually an expert in. So here, with Rudy Giuliani being a legal mind, we should perhaps listen to arguments of his based on his legal understanding. The fact that he may seem corrupt or be disgusting in some people's eyes has nothing to do with legalities. Similarly, take this argument. David Irvin is a Nazi sympathizer, so we can disregard everything he says about the Nazi regime. When we see this argument in standard form, we see that the second premise is obviously false. Everything that a Nazi sympathizer says about the Nazi regime is false. Well, if the Nazi sympathizer suggests perhaps that Hitler was a captivating public speaker, are we going to suggest this is false just because this person is biased and a sympathizer of the Nazi regime? Well, no. We need to look at the facts of whether or not something is true or false based on, let's say, for instance, Hitler being a captivating public speaker. David Irvin's bias or political leaning has no bearing on the captivation of someone's speech. This is a problem that we see all the time when we're watching the news or listening to arguments and hearing them from biased sources. Just because someone is biased doesn't make their argument bad. Arguments need to stand on their own merits regardless who says them. So if you're if you're listening to an argument from MSNBC or Fox News and suggesting that, well, of course that's what they're going to say, they're biased, this is a fallacy. We're in fact attacking the person making the argument rather than letting the argument stand on its own merits. When listening or reading an argument, we need to look at the premises and whether or not they infer the conclusion and whether or not they're true. Who says them is irrelevant. QUOQUE, or the pot calling the kettle black fallacy, is a type of ad hominem argument in which we confuse hypocrisy with a bad argument. Look at this argument. Jefferson was a slaveholder, so we can disregard all his fine words about human equality. Here we're saying that Jefferson claimed that humans are equal, but did not act on that view. And so Jefferson's view that humans are equal is false. Just because someone acts hypocritical doesn't mean their argument is false, because there are other factors that may go into why somebody does something. Perhaps that person is weak. Perhaps that is what the times in history demand. Perhaps lots of things can act on humans' behavior. Remember, it is the premises and conclusion that make an argument good, not the person who says that. So just because Jefferson may be a hypocrite for suggesting that people are equal, but then not treating people equally, doesn't mean his argument is any less good. Similarly, we may hear arguments like the following. America has no right to condemn terrorism. It itself kills innocent civilians in air raids all the time. Here we're suggesting that America has no right to condemn terrorism because drone strikes kill innocent people, making America a terrorist nation. Looking at it that way, of course. This, however, has no bearing on whether or not a country should or should not be terrorists or condemn terrorism. If we look at a country like Syria, for instance, and suggest to the leader that if the leader says that terrorism is bad, that's not false because someone in a terrorist country or someone in a country where terrorism is prevalent says it, so it must be wrong. We need to look at the argument instead. It doesn't matter who says that terrorism is bad, regardless if that country commits terrorist acts or doesn't. What makes terrorism wrong are the facts of morality and whether or not killing and terrorist acts are in fact wrong. Remember, it's not about who says it, it's about the argument presented. Another type of ad hominem or attack fallacy is the crime by association. Here we're suggesting that because you're associated with something bad, your argument must be bad. Take this one for instance. Vegetarianism is a wicked doctrine. Did you know that many Nazis were vegetarian? Here we're saying that vegetarianism is wicked because Nazis were wicked and Nazis are vegetarians. It's not about associating something negative with something else, making that thing negative. Instead, we need to look at why someone might suggest that vegetarianism is wicked or not wicked. We can't just compare things to others that are bad and suggest that they are also bad. I can similarly say that the Nazis breathed there, so all people who breathe air are bad and terrible. Here I would actually have to make an argument for why I thought people are all bad. I can't just associate one thing with another and suggest because there is some link there that both are equally bad or wrong. I need to be careful with the analogies that I draw. The next fallacy is the straw man fallacy. And the straw man fallacy is a fallacy in which we misrepresent someone's argument and do so in a weak way so that we can then tear down the argument later. Take this argument for example. Feminists want all women to be aggressive and badly dressed, therefore we should ignore their reprehensible views. Here we're saying we should not listen to feminists because of some other ridiculous idea that they have. The problem with this argument is that this isn't a position held by feminists, and therefore not something that we should associate with feminism. Once again, we have weakened a position by drawing an unfair and unrepresented analogy to a group or individual. When we purposefully or accidentally misrepresent a position, we are committing the straw man fallacy. This is why it's so important when reconstructing an argument that we are not putting words into the mouth of the person making the argument. We need to accurately reconstruct the argument by filling in missing premises and conclusions that ought to be there. Here's another example of a straw man taken from two positions. An evolutionary psychologist suggesting that sociologists are silly because they think the mind is a blank slate on which we can imprint whatever we want, and a sociologist claiming that evolutionary psychologists are silly because they think that all our traits are determined by genes, which is obviously false in itself. Here we're misrepresenting positions. Sociologists don't think that the mind is a blank slate in which we can imprint whatever we want. Sociologists believe that there are some things that we can imprint on the mind, but not necessarily all. Similarly, an evolutionary psychologist doesn't think that all our traits are determined by genes. Some of our traits are determined by social constructs. And so rather than these two positions being 100% sociologists versus 100% evolutionary psychologists, it's more along the lines of these two groups arguing that their position is right 60% of the time, while the other is right perhaps 40% of the time, and flipping it in each situation. The last argument that we're going to look at and focus on in this class is the red herring argument. Now, the red herring argument is a fallacy in which we change the subject mid-argument to kind of lead the person who is listening to the argument off in a different direction, or create an analogy that we don't necessarily need to relate to the original argument. Take this for instance. I think all reference to sex should be eliminated from films and music. Premarital sex and out-of-wedlock childbirths are creating moral decay in our society. Now, it's not this first premise that leads to the second premise, nor is it the second premise that leads to the first. These are two different arguments that both require their own sets of premises to support. So if I were to think that all reference to sex should be eliminated from films, I would need to explain why I think that's the case. Now, I might claim that we should eliminate that because premarital sex and out-of-wedlock childbirths are prevalent in film, but I can't necessarily suggest that they are contributing to moral decay in our society without providing a separate argument for why that is. The red herring argument starts the argument off on one path and then concludes it with a very different argument. This exercise is indicative of the types of questions you're going to see on this quiz and also your final exam. I will present an argument and you will need to tell me what fallacy is being committed. So pause the video now to work on this yourself. So when we recreate this argument, we see it written in standard form like this. A large majority of scientists are atheists. If a large majority of scientists believe X, then X is true. Atheism is true, therefore theism is false. We can look at 2 and suggest that the mistake in believing this premise to be true lies in the fact that why we think theism is false is because that's what scientists believe, or that atheism is true because that's what scientists believe. So here we're suggesting that theism is false because that's what other people believe. When remember, it's not what other people believe that makes something true, it is facts about the world that make something true. So here, the fallacy that is being committed is the appeal to authority, or we can say the appeal to common practice. There are often instances where one argument may commit multiple types of fallacies. Here, either appeal to common practice or appeal to authority would be acceptable. When it comes time to the quiz, there will not be instances of arguments that are stated in a way where multiple problems or multiple fallacies will be committed. I will provide you, for instance, in the quiz with multiple choices of answers that are one fallacy or the other, and there will not be multiple right answers.